The Last Voyage of the Atlantic Star, a relaxing historical sleep story set on the Atlantic Ocean. Part 1. The first light of dawn spread slowly across the calm waters surrounding New York Harbor. It was the spring of 1838, a season when the Atlantic Ocean awakened from the harsh grip of winter. The cold winds still lingered, yet the promise of warmer days rested gently upon the horizon. Hundreds of people had gathered along the wooden docks before sunrise. Some stood quietly beside heavy trunks tied with thick rope. Others hugged their families one final time. Children watched seagulls circle overhead, while sailors carried barrels of fresh water, flour, salted beef, lantern oil, and supplies that would hopefully last many weeks at sea. Waiting patiently beside the pier stood one of the largest sailing passenger ships of her time. Her name was Atlantic Star. 3 tall masts reached proudly toward the brightening sky. Fresh white sails rested neatly against the yards. Strong oak timbers formed her graceful hull. Polished brass lanterns reflected the morning sunlight. She was neither the fastest ship nor the newest, but among experienced sailors, she carried another reputation. She always came home. For nearly 15 years, the Atlantic Star had crossed the Atlantic Ocean between New York and distant European ports, surviving storms that destroyed younger vessels. Many believed the ship possessed extraordinary luck. Captain Nathaniel Brooks smiled politely whenever he heard such stories. Luck, he often said, belonged only to those who respected the sea. At 58 years of age, Captain Brooks had spent almost his entire life on the Atlantic. Deep lines marked his weathered face. His gray beard moved gently with every breeze. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely hurried. The ocean had taught him that calm decisions saved more lives than quick reactions. Standing beside him was First Officer Samuel Reed, only 32 years old, but already respected throughout New York Harbor. Samuel carried charts beneath one arm while checking the tide with careful attention. Behind them, dozens of sailors climbed the rigging with practiced confidence. Every knot, every pulley, every sail, every rope was inspected one final time. Below deck, nearly 260 passengers slowly found their assigned cabins. Their stories were all different. A young carpenter hoping to begin a new business. An elderly schoolteacher returning home after visiting family overseas. A widow traveling with 2 quiet daughters. Several merchants transporting valuable textiles. Doctors, blacksmiths, bookkeepers, musicians, farmers, dreamers. Each carried hopes much heavier than the trunks they packed. Near the bow stood a young woman named Clara Whitmore, 26 years old. She held a leather journal tightly against her coat. Her father had spent decades creating coastal maps for American lighthouse stations along the Atlantic coast. Before his passing the previous autumn, he had spoken often of the ocean. Every voyage, he once told her, changes the people aboard far more than it changes the sea. Clara never forgot those words. She hoped to record every sunrise, every storm, every face, every quiet conversation. Not for fame, not for money, simply so no ordinary life would ever be forgotten. Nearby, 11-year-old Thomas Ellis watched sailors with endless curiosity. Everything fascinated him. The creaking wooden cranes, the fluttering flags, the enormous anchor chains, even the smell of fresh pine tar covering the decks. His mother laughed softly as he counted the ship's lifeboats for the 3rd time that morning. "I wonder," Thomas whispered, "how deep the Atlantic really is." No sailor answered immediately. Finally, an old deckhand smiled. "Deep enough," he replied gently, "to remind every captain to stay humble." Thomas thought carefully before nodding. It sounded like exactly the sort of answer the ocean would give. As morning continued, church bells echoed across New York. Dock workers untied the heavy mooring ropes. The harbor slowly filled with movement. Smaller fishing boats drifted aside. Merchants waved hats from neighboring piers. Families called out final farewells. Some smiled through tears. Others simply stood in silence. Captain Brooks removed his hat, raised the mainsail. The command passed from sailor to sailor. Moments later, enormous white canvas unfolded into the spring wind. One sail, then another, then another. The Atlantic star awakened. Wood groaned gently beneath shifting weight. Rigging hummed softly overhead. The great vessel eased away from the pier almost silently. Cheers followed from the harbor. Handkerchiefs waved through the morning air. Children shouted until the voices blended with the cries of distant gulls. Slowly, very slowly, New York Harbor began disappearing behind them. Ahead waited only the endless Atlantic Ocean. No passenger could know that within the coming days they would witness towering storms, strange drifting wreckage, acts of extraordinary courage, and moments that would bind complete strangers together for the rest of their lives. For now, however, the sea remained peaceful. Gentle waves rolled beneath the hull like slow breathing. Sunlight shimmered across the water in thousands of tiny reflections. The breeze carried the clean scent of salt mixed with distant pine forests fading along the American coastline. Captain Brooks studied the western horizon one final time before turning east. His experienced eyes noticed something few others did. Far beyond the clear blue sky, almost impossible to see, a long, pale band of clouds rested quietly above the Atlantic. Not threatening, not yet, just waiting. He said nothing. Instead, he folded his brass telescope, slipped it into his coat, and continued watching the horizon with the calm patience only a lifetime at sea could teach. And so, beneath bright skies and hopeful hearts, the Atlantic star began a voyage that none aboard would ever forget. The silent waters. The Atlantic star had now been at sea for 4 peaceful days. Behind her, the coastline of America had disappeared completely. Ahead, there was only the endless Atlantic Ocean. No land, no harbor, no lighthouse, only sky meeting water in every direction. The passengers slowly settled into the quiet rhythm of life at sea. Each morning began with the ringing of the ship's brass bell. The cooks prepared warm porridge and fresh bread, while sailors climbed the towering masts to inspect every rope stretched tightly against the wind. Children chased one another across the open deck. Musicians played gentle melodies with violins near sunset. Older passengers gathered beneath canvas awnings, sharing stories of forgotten towns, old farms, and families waiting across the ocean. It was peaceful, perhaps too peaceful. Captain Nathaniel Brooks had crossed the Atlantic more than 70 times. He understood something many younger sailors never learned. The ocean often became its quietest, just before it changed its mind. Every evening, just before darkness settled across the sea, Captain Brooks climbed alone to the quarterdeck. He carried the same polished brass telescope, the same weather journal, the same careful expression. Each sunset he wrote only a few short lines. Day 1, favorable winds. Day 2, calm waters. Day 3, unusually steady pressure. Day 4, seabirds gone. That final sentence caught First Officer Samuel Reed's attention. No birds, Samuel asked quietly. Captain Brooks closed the journal. Have you noticed them? Samuel looked toward the empty sky. Only days earlier dozens of gulls had followed the ship. Now, there were none. Not one. Captain Brooks answered almost in a whisper. Birds leave before storms. Samuel looked upward. But the sky is perfectly clear. The captain nodded. I know. Some lessons could not be explained, only remembered. Below deck, life continued as though nothing had changed. Clara Whitmore spent hours writing inside her leather journal. She described everything she saw: the sound of waves against oak, the smell of sea salt drifting through open windows, the laughter of children, the quiet patience of sailors repairing worn canvas. She believed every ordinary moment deserved to be remembered. Late that afternoon, she noticed something unusual. An elderly passenger stood alone near the stern every evening, always facing west, always silent. He never joined the others, never played cards, never laughed, never even introduced himself, only watched the water, as though waiting for something, or someone, to appear. Young Thomas Ellis continued exploring every corner of the great ship. The sailors had grown fond of the curious 11-year-old. They showed him how ropes were tied, how sails caught the wind, how compasses never lied. One sailor even allowed Thomas to polish an old brass lantern. But there was one place every sailor warned him never to visit after sunset: the forward cargo hold. Why? Thomas asked. The sailors exchanged amused smiles. It isn't haunted, one laughed. It's simply dangerous. Heavy cargo shifted during rough seas. Massive barrels could roll without warning. Yet, Thomas noticed something strange. Each night, just after midnight, he heard footsteps above the cargo hold. Not running, not working, walking, slow, measured, deliberate footsteps. When he mentioned them during breakfast, every sailor quietly looked at one another. No one answered. On the evening of the 5th day, the Atlantic Ocean changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, almost politely. The wind disappeared. Every sail hung motionless. The ocean became smoother than polished glass. Even the smallest wave vanished. The ship stopped moving. Completely. Passengers leaned against the railings. Confused, children tossed tiny pebbles into the water. Each splash echoed farther than seemed possible. It was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no birds, no waves. Even the wooden hull stopped creaking. Captain Brooks slowly removed his hat. He had witnessed this only twice before. "The sea is holding its breath," he murmured. Samuel frowned. "I've never seen anything like this." The captain answered without taking his eyes from the horizon. "I was hoping you never would." Hours passed. Nothing moved. Not even the clouds. Night arrived slowly. The moon climbed above the Atlantic like a silver lantern. Its reflection stretched across perfectly still water for miles. The passengers admired the beauty. Some called it magical. Others called it peaceful. Captain Brooks called it dangerous. He ordered extra watches throughout the night. No one complained. The experienced sailors had already noticed something else. The temperature was falling. Far too quickly. Around midnight, a young lookout shouted from high above the mast. Light ahead. Every sailor looked east. Far across the silent ocean, a single lantern flickered, then disappeared, then appeared again. One lonely light. Impossible. There were no ports nearby, no islands, no shipping lanes. Only open Atlantic. Captain Brooks lifted his telescope. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Samuel waited patiently. Finally, the captain lowered the telescope very slowly. His face had changed. "What is it?" Samuel asked. Captain Brooks answered quietly. "It isn't a lighthouse." Samuel waited. "It isn't a fishing boat." Another silence. Then the captain spoke the words every sailor hoped never to hear in the middle of the Atlantic. "It's a ship." Samuel looked relieved. "Then perhaps she needs help." Captain Brooks did not answer immediately. Instead, he handed Samuel the telescope. "Count her sails." Samuel looked carefully. His expression slowly disappeared. "There aren't any." "Exactly." Samuel swallowed. "A drifting ship?" Captain Brooks nodded. "No sails, no movement, no signal flags, no crew visible, only one lantern, burning in the darkness." Hundreds of miles from the nearest harbor, the passengers had begun gathering quietly along the railings. Even Clara closed her journal. The mysterious vessel slowly became clearer beneath the moonlight. It was enormous, older than the Atlantic Star. Its towering masts stood like black skeletons against the silver sky. Its sails were gone. Its deck appeared empty. No voices, no movement, only that single lonely lantern, still burning, as though someone, or something, was patiently waiting. Captain Brooks remained perfectly still. After several long moments, he turned toward Samuel. "Wake every officer." Samuel hurried away. The captain looked once more toward the drifting vessel. Then, in a calm voice that somehow carried across the silent deck, he gave an order no passenger expected. No one is to approach that ship until sunrise. No explanation followed, only silence. And across the endless Atlantic, the abandoned ship continued drifting closer, inch by inch, through water so still, it looked like polished black glass. Part 3. The ship that had no voices. The first light of dawn arrived slowly. Soft shades of gold stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, revealing a sea so calm that it reflected the morning sky like polished glass. For a few quiet moments, no one aboard the Atlantic Star spoke. Every pair of eyes remained fixed upon the drifting vessel. During the darkness it had appeared almost unreal. Now, beneath the rising sun, its details became clearer. She was magnificent, or perhaps she had once been. Her hull was built from thick white oak, now faded to a weathered gray. Long cracks stretched across her sides. Barnacles clung to the waterline. The carved figurehead at her bow had lost one arm to years of storms and salt. Her 3 towering masts still stood proudly, but every sail had vanished. Only broken ropes swayed gently in the faint morning breeze that had finally returned. A faded name remained barely visible beneath layers of salt and age. Morning Grace. Captain Nathaniel Brooks narrowed his eyes. He whispered the name to himself. Morning Grace. First Officer Samuel Reed looked surprised. "You've heard of her?" The captain nodded slowly. 23 years ago. Samuel waited. She sailed from Boston. And Captain Brooks looked toward the empty deck of the drifting ship. No one ever learned what became of her. The passengers had gathered quietly along the railings. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stared. Children who usually laughed across the deck remained unusually silent. Even Thomas Ellis stood beside his mother without asking questions. The ocean itself seemed to understand that this was no ordinary meeting between 2 ships. Captain Brooks finally gave his orders. "Mr. Reed." "Sir." "Choose 6 men. The most experienced. No weapons." Samuel hesitated. "No weapons. If anyone is alive aboard." The captain answered calmly. "They need help. And if no one is?" "Covered with dust." Captain Brooks gently touched it. The leather cracked beneath his fingers. Years old, yet strangely untouched. Nearby, an open logbook rested inside a wooden box. Its pages fluttered softly. Captain Brooks carefully lifted it. Most pages had faded beyond reading. Salt water had erased countless entries. Only the final page remained mostly dry. The captain adjusted his spectacles. Slowly, he began reading aloud. September 3rd, 1815. Wind favorable. Crew healthy. Passengers cheerful. Expected arrival within 8 days. The next entry, written in shakier handwriting. Read. September 6th. Heavy fog. Compass behaving strangely. Unfamiliar current. No stars visible. Crew uneasy. Captain Brooks turned another page. His expression slowly changed. The final words had been written with trembling ink. September 8th. The fog has not lifted. We hear another ship's bell every night. But no ship can be seen. 3 sailors vanished before sunrise. No struggle, no sound. The passengers refuse to sleep. The sea no longer feels natural. If anyone finds this vessel, do not follow the bell. Silence. Only the gentle sound of water touching the hull. Samuel looked around uneasily. There must be another explanation. Captain Brooks closed the journal. There always is. He paused. But first, he looked toward the empty deck. We need facts. The sailors spread across the vessel. Every cabin was searched carefully. The dining hall remained almost untouched. Wooden bowls still rested upon the tables. A violin leaned quietly against one chair. Children's toys lay scattered across the floor. Everything suggested people had expected to return within minutes, not disappear forever. One sailor entered the captain's cabin. Inside, the fireplace contained cold ashes. Maps covered the desk. A pocket watch rested beside an unfinished letter. The watch had stopped. Its hands forever pointed toward 2:17. Meanwhile, deep below deck, Samuel entered the cargo hold. Barrels remained stacked neatly. Crates of tea, cotton, glass bottles, medical supplies. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing disturbed. Then, he noticed something unusual. The floor was wet, not with seawater, fresh water. Tiny droplets continued falling from somewhere above. Samuel lifted his lantern. There, high between 2 beams, hung a length of brand new rope. Impossible. Everything else aboard had aged more than 20 years. Yet this rope looked almost new, as though someone had replaced it very recently. He stepped closer, then froze. Footprints, clear footprints, in the thin layer of dust. Not old, fresh. Someone had walked through this room. Not years ago. Recently. Very recently. The footprints led toward a narrow storage door. Samuel slowly reached for the handle. The old hinges groaned softly. The lantern light entered first. Dust floated lazily through the darkness. The tiny room appeared empty. Completely empty. Then, he heard it. A single sound. Very faint. Almost impossible to notice. Tap. 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 3 slow knocks. Coming from the other side of the wooden wall. Samuel's heartbeat quickened. He raised the lantern higher. The tapping stopped. Silence returned. He waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. Nothing. Perhaps. He imagined it. Perhaps. The ship was simply settling with the waves. Trying to remain calm, Samuel stepped backward. Then his lantern illuminated something carved into the inside of the wall. Not old. The wood was still pale where it had been cut. Someone had carved only 4 words. Don't let them hear. Samuel stared at the message. His mouth suddenly felt dry. There was no signature. No date. Nothing else. Only those 4 words. Above deck, Captain Brooks called his name. Mr. Reed. Samuel quickly closed the storage door. One final glance at the carved warning. Then he climbed back toward the sunlight. He decided, for the moment, not to tell anyone what he had found, because he wasn't yet sure whether the greatest danger on the Morning Grace had already passed, or whether it had quietly boarded the Atlantic Star without anyone noticing. Part 4. The storm that changed its course. The sun had climbed higher above the Atlantic, washing the endless ocean with a warm golden light that made the water appear calm and almost inviting. From a distance, nothing about the sea suggested danger. Gentle swells rolled beneath both ships, and a soft breeze carried the familiar scent of salt across the open deck. To the passengers aboard the Atlantic Star, it looked like another peaceful morning. Some even smiled with relief after seeing Captain Brooks and his men return safely from the mysterious vessel. They believed the worst was already behind them. But Captain Nathaniel Brooks had spent nearly 40 years reading the language of the sea, and he had learned long ago that the ocean often hid its greatest dangers beneath its calmest surface. As he stepped back onto the deck of the Atlantic Star, he did not look at the passengers or the crew. His eyes lifted toward the eastern horizon, where a thin gray line rested just above the water. It was almost invisible to anyone else, yet to an experienced sailor it carried a warning more serious than any shouted alarm. Samuel Reed followed behind him, still holding the worn leather logbook they had recovered from the morning grace. The words written inside refused to leave his thoughts. The mysterious disappearances, the strange fog, the unexplained bell heard every night. None of it made complete sense. Samuel was not a superstitious man. He believed every mystery had a logical explanation, yet something about that abandoned ship unsettled him in a way he could not explain. Captain Brooks finally broke the silence. "Mr. Reed," he said quietly, "have the men secure every loose barrel, tighten every line, and inspect every lifeboat. Double the watch beginning this afternoon." Samuel looked surprised. "The sky is still clear, Captain. It won't remain that way." There was no fear in the captain's voice, only certainty. Life aboard the Atlantic Star continued through the afternoon, although an invisible tension had settled over the ship. The sailors moved faster than usual, checking ropes that had already been checked twice that morning. Extra lanterns were filled with fresh oil. Spare sails were folded and tied more securely. Even the ship's cook noticed that the crew spoke in lower voices than before. The passengers sensed that something had changed, even if they could not name it. Clara Whitmore continued writing in her journal from a bench near the stern, describing how the atmosphere aboard the ship felt different from previous days. The laughter of children had grown quieter. Conversations ended more quickly. People found themselves staring toward the horizon for no reason they could explain, as though instinct urged every soul aboard to search the sea for something unseen. Young Thomas Ellis wandered across the deck carrying a small wooden telescope one of the sailors had carved for him. He climbed onto a storage crate and slowly scanned the horizon, pretending to be the ship's lookout. At first he saw nothing except endless water. Then, far away to the southeast, he noticed something unusual. The sea was changing color. Instead of the bright blue that surrounded the Atlantic Star, one distant section of the ocean appeared almost black. Above it floated a wall of clouds unlike any he had ever seen. They did not drift lazily across the sky. They stood together in a single towering mass, rising higher and higher as though someone had built a mountain from smoke. Thomas hurried toward Captain Brooks. "Captain," he called, slightly out of breath. "The ocean looks dark over there." Brooks accepted the small telescope and looked exactly where the boy pointed. He needed only a few seconds. When he lowered the telescope, every trace of calm disappeared from his expression. "Ring the warning bell," he ordered. The sharp sound echoed across the ship. Passengers stopped talking. Sailors immediately abandoned their ordinary duties and rushed to their assigned positions without asking a single question. Years of discipline had taught them that when Captain Brooks gave an order without explanation, there was always a reason. "Reduce the upper sails," he continued. "Secure the cargo below deck. Every passenger is to remain inside after sunset unless instructed otherwise." Within minutes, the peaceful passenger ship transformed into a machine preparing for survival. Thick ropes were tightened until they sang against the wind. Heavy cargo was chained firmly to the deck beams. Windows below deck were sealed against seawater. Every sailor moved with quiet efficiency, while Captain Brooks stood near the helm, never taking his eyes from the growing darkness far beyond the horizon. Late that evening, the wind returned. At first it came as a gentle whisper that barely stirred the edge of a sailor's coat. Then it grew stronger, carrying a chill that did not belong to a spring evening. The temperature fell noticeably within a single hour, and the calm Atlantic began to change. Small waves became larger. The larger waves began rolling in unusual directions. Instead of moving together, they crossed one another, creating confused patterns that caused the Atlantic star to sway unpredictably. Samuel frowned as he studied the compass. "The wind is coming from the southeast," he said. Captain Brooks nodded. "But the waves are arriving from the northeast." Samuel looked back at the water. "That shouldn't happen." "No," the captain replied quietly. "It shouldn't." As darkness covered the Atlantic, lightning flickered silently within the distant wall of clouds. There was no thunder yet, only brief flashes of white light hidden inside the storm, illuminating its enormous shape for a fraction of a second before disappearing again. The passengers watched through cabin windows with growing unease. Some prayed softly. Others tried to reassure frightened children. Clara sat beneath the glow of a small oil lamp, writing one final sentence in her journal before closing it carefully. "Tonight, the sea feels as though it remembers something." She had no idea how true those words would become. Just before midnight, the first heavy wave struck the Atlantic star. It crashed against the bow with enough force to send cold seawater racing across the deck. The ship groaned deeply, her massive wooden frame absorbing the impact as sailors fought to keep their footing. Another wave followed, then another. The wind howled through the rigging, and the once orderly sails snapped violently overhead like enormous white whips. Captain Brooks gripped the wheel with both hands. For the first time since leaving New York Harbor, he shouted, "Hold her steady." The Atlantic star climbed the face of a towering wave, rising higher and higher until, for one breathtaking moment, everyone aboard could see nothing except black water below and dark sky above. Then the ship plunged down the other side. Passengers screamed. Lanterns swung wildly from the ceiling. Wood creaked under immense strain. Somewhere below deck, the sound of breaking crates echoed through the darkness. And far beyond the storm, hidden between curtains of rain, a single lonely lantern appeared once again. The same pale light they had seen aboard the abandoned Morning Grace. It was impossible. That ship had been left many miles behind. Yet the light was there, waiting, as though it had been expecting them all along. Captain Brooks never took his eyes away from the lonely lantern shining beyond the curtain of rain. For a brief moment, he questioned whether the storm itself was playing tricks upon exhausted eyes. Yet every instinct he had sharpened over 40 years at sea told him otherwise. That light was real. It burned with the same steady glow they had witnessed only hours earlier aboard the abandoned Morning Grace. And somehow it now appeared far ahead of them, where no ship could possibly have sailed in such a short time. Samuel Reed climbed toward the quarterdeck, soaked from head to toe as rainwater streamed from the brim of his hat. He followed the captain's gaze and immediately saw the same pale light flickering through the darkness. "Captain, that cannot be the Morning Grace." Brooks answered without looking away. "No." "Then what are we seeing?" For several long seconds the captain remained silent, while another towering wave lifted the Atlantic star high above the raging sea before dropping her heavily into the valley below. Every timber groaned beneath the strain, every rope stretched to its limit, and yet the old ship continued fighting forward. Finally, Captain Brooks spoke in a calm voice that somehow rose above the roaring wind. "I don't know." Those 3 words frightened Samuel more than the storm itself. During all the years they had sailed together, he had never once heard Captain Brooks admit uncertainty. Below deck, The passengers had gathered inside the main dining hall where heavy tables had been secured to the floor. Mothers wrapped blankets around sleeping children, while elderly travelers quietly whispered prayers. Every few moments, another powerful wave struck the hull, causing the lanterns hanging from the ceiling to sway violently and cast dancing shadows across the wooden walls. Clara Whitmore sat near one of the narrow windows with her leather journal resting upon her lap. She tried to continue writing, but each sentence became shorter than the last as the ship rolled beneath her. Finally, she closed the journal and simply listened. She realized that every sound aboard the Atlantic Star had changed. The familiar creaking of timber had become deeper. The wind no longer whistled, it roared. Even the footsteps of sailors racing across the deck carried a new urgency. It felt as though the ship herself understood that something far greater than an ordinary Atlantic storm was unfolding around them. Near the cargo hold, young Thomas Ellis stood beside his mother, trying to appear brave despite the fear in his eyes. One of the older sailors placed a reassuring hand upon the boy's shoulder and smiled. "She's a strong ship," the sailor said gently. "The Atlantic Star has survived worse than this." Thomas nodded, wanting to believe him. At that very moment, however, a deafening crack echoed through the storm. Everyone froze. The sound had not come from thunder. It had come from the ship. High above the deck, the great foremast shuddered violently as one of its massive support lines snapped under the relentless force of the wind. Sailors rushed forward with axes and spare rope, fighting desperately to prevent the towering mast from collapsing onto the deck. Captain Brooks watched the chaos for only a second before issuing a series of calm, precise orders. Every sailor moved instantly. No shouting, no panic, only disciplined action. This was exactly why the Atlantic Star had earned her legendary reputation. Then, just as suddenly as the storm had reached its greatest fury, something happened that no experienced sailor aboard had ever witnessed before. The wind stopped. Not gradually, not naturally. It simply ceased. The enormous sails, which had been straining violently only seconds earlier, fell limp without warning. The rain ended. The roaring waves settled. Samuel quickly closed the storage door. One final glance at the carved warning. Then he climbed back toward the sunlight. He decided, for the moment, not to tell anyone what he had found, because he wasn't yet sure whether the greatest danger on the Morning Grace had already passed, or whether it had quietly boarded the Atlantic Star without anyone noticing. Part 5. The Bell Across the Atlantic. The Atlantic Star had survived countless storms during her long years upon the sea, yet no sailor aboard had ever witnessed anything quite like the silence that now surrounded them. Only moments earlier, the Atlantic had roared with towering waves, shrieking wind, and blinding rain. Now the ocean lay unnaturally calm beneath a circle of clear stars, while the dark wall of storm clouds remained frozen around them like enormous cliffs built from shadow. It was as though the ship had unknowingly sailed into the eye of a storm so vast that it seemed to exist outside the ordinary rhythm of nature itself. Captain Nathaniel Brooks stood motionless beside the great wooden wheel, his weathered face illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern hanging above the quarterdeck. He had crossed the Atlantic more than 70 times, had buried friends beneath these waters, had survived hurricanes that split younger ships in half, and had learned to trust his instincts long before he trusted instruments. Yet even after a lifetime upon the sea, nothing in his experience could explain what he was now seeing. Less than 400 yards away, moving slowly through the silver moonlight, sailed the Morning Grace. Only hours earlier, she had been a lifeless wreck drifting aimlessly upon the ocean, her sails torn away, her deck abandoned, and every cabin swallowed by decades of silence. Now her masts carried enough canvas to move steadily through the calm water, although no sailor could be seen adjusting the lines. Her wheel turned gently from side to side, without visible hands guiding it, and the same lonely lantern hanging near her bow continued to burn with a steady amber glow that never flickered, despite the wind that had raged only moments before. Not a single voice came from her deck. Not a single footstep echoed across her timbers. Only the slow, rhythmic sound of a brass bell drifted across the still Atlantic. Dong! The deep tone rolled gently across the water. Several passengers instinctively looked toward the source of the sound. A few removed their hats. Others quietly crossed themselves without fully understanding why. The bell rang again, exactly the same distance apart. Exactly the same tone. It was not loud. It was not threatening. In fact, there was something strangely peaceful about it. That peacefulness unsettled Captain Brooks more than any scream could have. He slowly reached into the pocket of his heavy wool coat and removed an old silver pocket watch, its polished surface worn smooth after decades of use. He listened carefully, counting the seconds between each chime. 30. Exactly 30. Another bell. Another 30 seconds. Another bell. Nothing about the sound was random. Someone, or something, was keeping perfect time. Samuel Reed stepped quietly beside him, careful not to disturb the captain's concentration. "Captain," he said in a low voice, "the helm is still locked." Brooks nodded without looking away from the distant vessel. "I know." Samuel hesitated. "Then, why are we changing course?" Only then did Captain Brooks glance toward the great wheel. The thick oak spokes remained secured exactly where the helmsman had left them. No sailor stood beside them. No rope had slipped. No mechanical failure was visible. Yet the bow of the Atlantic Star continued turning, inch by inch, toward the morning grace, as though an invisible current beneath the surface had gently taken hold of the ship. Brooks walked to the rail and looked over the side. The water below reflected the moon so perfectly that it resembled polished black glass. There was almost no movement, no powerful current, no whirlpool, nothing that should have been capable of turning a vessel weighing hundreds of tons. He whispered almost to himself, "This sea is hiding something." Far below deck, Clara Whitmore remained awake despite the late hour. Sleep had become impossible after the storm, and the strange silence pressing against the wooden walls filled her with quiet unease. She opened her journal once again and dipped the tip of her pen into fresh ink. For several minutes, she simply stared at the blank page before finally writing a single sentence. There are moments when the ocean becomes so quiet that it feels less like water and more like memory. She paused, reading the words again. Her father had once told her that every great voyage left behind stories too strange for official records. Sailors often spoke of them only after many years had passed, usually beside warm fireplaces where no one could accuse them of frightening young crews before a voyage. As a child, she had believed those tales to be little more than colorful exaggerations. Tonight, she was no longer certain. Captain Brooks slowly folded the silver pocket watch and slipped it back inside his coat. The rhythm of the bell continued across the silent Atlantic with almost unnatural precision, yet he forced himself to think like a sailor rather than a frightened man. Throughout his career, he had learned that the sea rewarded reason and punished panic. Every mystery eventually revealed an explanation to those patient enough to wait for it. Still, something deep inside him whispered that this voyage would test every lesson he had ever learned. He turned toward the quartermaster and spoke in a voice that carried quiet authority rather than fear. "Keep every lantern burning tonight. No sailor is to leave his assigned post, and no one is to board another vessel unless I give the order myself. Whatever that ship is, we will observe her before we approach her." The crew nodded immediately. Years of sailing under Captain Brooks had taught them that his caution had saved more lives than reckless courage ever could. Far below the main deck, the passengers struggled to find comfort after the violence of the storm. Children who had cried themselves to sleep were finally resting in their mother's arms, while older travelers whispered stories simply to distract one another from the unsettling silence outside. The Atlantic Star no longer rocked with heavy waves, yet very few people felt at peace. It was the strange stillness that disturbed them most. Every person aboard could sense that the ocean itself seemed to be listening. Clara Whitmore carefully closed her journal and walked toward one of the narrow stern windows. Beyond the glass, the moonlight spread across the Atlantic like liquid silver. She could just make out the distant outline of the mysterious vessel, gliding effortlessly through the calm sea. There was something strangely elegant about it. It no longer resembled an abandoned wreck, but rather a proud passenger ship sailing exactly as she must have looked many years earlier. Then Clara noticed something unusual. A figure, only for a brief moment, standing near the bow, tall, wearing what appeared to be a long, dark naval coat. The figure remained perfectly still before disappearing behind the ship's mast. Clara blinked several times. When she looked again, the deck was empty. She said nothing. Perhaps exhaustion after the storm had deceived her eyes. On the quarterdeck, Samuel Reed spread several navigation charts across a heavy oak table. A lantern burned beside him as he compared the ship's position with every map available. None of them made sense. According to the compass, they had barely drifted during the storm. According to the stars, they had moved several miles farther south than expected. According to the current, they should have been traveling east. Samuel quietly shook his head. For the first time in his career, every instrument aboard the Atlantic Star seemed to disagree with the others. Captain Brooks noticed the expression on his first officer's face. "What troubles you?" Samuel pointed toward the charts. "I trust these maps, Captain." "So do I." "I trust the compass." "So do I." Samuel looked directly into the captain's eyes. But tonight, none of them agree. Captain Brooks slowly rolled the maps together. "Then tonight," he replied, "we trust experience instead." Shortly after midnight, the lookout suddenly called down from the mainmast. "Movement aboard the Morning Grace." Every sailor immediately looked toward the mysterious ship. Captain Brooks raised his telescope. The deck, which had appeared completely deserted only minutes earlier, now seemed different. Several lanterns glowed softly along her port side. One by one, they began lighting themselves. No sailor walked from lantern to lantern. No flame could be seen. Yet each lamp awakened with a warm amber glow until nearly a dozen illuminated the abandoned vessel. The passengers standing near the windows gasped quietly. From a distance, the Morning Grace no longer looked abandoned at all. She looked alive, almost welcoming. Then, without warning, music drifted across the water. Not loud, not haunting, simply the gentle sound of a violin carried by the night air. The melody was beautiful, old-fashioned, the kind of tune that might once have accompanied passengers dancing beneath lanterns during peaceful evenings at sea. Several people aboard the Atlantic Star smiled without realizing it. An elderly gentleman whispered, "Someone survived?" A young mother softly murmured, "Perhaps they're asking for help." Even some sailors exchanged hopeful glances. Only Captain Brooks remained expressionless. His eyes never left the distant ship. Finally he spoke. "Cover your ears." Samuel looked confused. "Captain, do it." Without hesitation, the older sailors obeyed. The younger crew followed a moment later. Many passengers watched curiously, unsure why such an order had been given. The violin continued. Its melody seemed strangely comforting, almost familiar, as though everyone listening had heard it somewhere before, perhaps many years ago. Then Thomas Ellis quietly stood up. His eyes remained fixed upon the morning grace. Without saying a word, the 11-year-old boy began walking toward the railing. His mother called his name. He did not answer. Another passenger reached for his shoulder. Thomas gently pulled away, never taking his eyes from the distant ship. Step by step, he continued walking. His face showed no fear, only calm determination. Captain Brooks crossed the deck in seconds and firmly caught the boy by his arm. Thomas immediately stopped. He blinked several times, looking around in confusion. "Captain," he whispered, "why am I standing here?" Brooks did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the morning grace. The violin had stopped. The lanterns went dark, one after another, until only the single lonely bow lantern remained. Samuel stared at the captain. "You knew?" Brooks slowly released the boy's arm. "When I was 16 years old," he said quietly. "An old lighthouse keeper warned me that the Atlantic sometimes carries sounds farther than it should." Samuel frowned. "What kind of sounds?" The captain's weathered face remained fixed upon the darkness. "The kind a tired sailor wants to follow." At that exact moment, a sailor searching the recovered logbook called from below. "Captain, I've found another page." Captain Brooks turned immediately. The last pages were stuck together. The sailor shouted, "And I think the captain of the Morning Grace left one final message." The entire crew fell silent. Whatever had happened aboard that forgotten ship, its answer had finally begun to reveal itself. Part 6. The Captain's Final Log. The sailor who had discovered the hidden page climbed the narrow staircase from below deck with unusual care, holding the fragile journal in both hands as though it were made of glass instead of worn leather. Years of salt, moisture, and neglect had caused several pages to stick together so tightly that no one had realized another entry remained hidden beneath them. Only while gently drying the book beside a lantern had the final sheet separated from the others, revealing ink that had somehow survived more than 2 decades upon the Atlantic. Captain Nathaniel Brooks accepted the journal without a word. Around him, the crew gathered in respectful silence. Even the passengers nearest the quarterdeck sensed that something important had been found. The mysterious bell had fallen quiet. The distant outline of the Morning Grace was barely visible through drifting mist, and for the first time since the storm, the Atlantic itself seemed to be waiting. Brooks adjusted his spectacles and carefully unfolded the brittle page. The handwriting was uneven, but still readable. At the very top, beneath the date September 10th, 1815, one sentence had been written with remarkable clarity. "If this journal is found, do not fear our ship. Fear the sea that trapped us." The captain paused. Samuel Reed looked up immediately. "Trapped?" Brooks nodded. "It doesn't say haunted. It says trapped." He continued reading. "On the 7th night after leaving Boston, we entered a region of dense fog unlike any I have known in 30 years at sea. The wind died without warning, and an unusual current carried us steadily south despite every sail being trimmed correctly. For 2 days we could neither see the sun nor the stars. Our compass varied wildly, sometimes changing direction by nearly 20 degrees within a single hour." Samuel quietly reached for one of the navigation charts lying beside him. "Captain," he whispered, "our own compass behaved strangely last night." Brooks said nothing. He simply continued. "Several passengers believed another vessel was following us through the fog because they heard bells and music during the night. We searched repeatedly but found nothing except sound carried across the water. Mr. Collins, our navigator, believed unusual layers of warm and cold air above the Atlantic were bending sound farther than nature normally allows. I pray he is correct. Samuel slowly lowered the chart. So they heard the bell too. Captain Brooks closed the journal for a moment. Not because of ghosts. He looked toward the dark horizon. Because the Atlantic can sometimes play strange tricks on the senses. One of the older sailors nodded. My grandfather told me about that. Cold air over warm water. Voices carrying for miles. Brooks smiled faintly. Your grandfather understood the sea. The captain resumed reading. On the morning of September 11th, our lookout finally sighted another ship. We altered course, believing rescue was near. By sunset, we realized we had been chasing the same distant silhouette all day without ever gaining upon it. Mr. Collins called the phenomenon a false horizon, caused by unusual conditions of light above the sea. The men grew frightened, believing the ocean itself wished to mislead us. Samuel looked toward the fading outline of the morning grace. So, they weren't chasing another ship. No, they were chasing a mirage. Captain Brooks nodded slowly. A superior mirage. He had witnessed the rare phenomenon only once before, far north near Newfoundland, where unusual layers of air sometimes lifted distant ships above the horizon, making them appear impossibly close while remaining many miles away. The realization settled heavily upon the crew. Perhaps the strange lantern they had followed during the storm had never been where they believed it to be. Just then, the ship's carpenter hurried across the deck carrying a length of broken timber. Captain, Brooks looked up. We've inspected the damage from the hurricane. And the foremast can be repaired. Good. But the carpenter hesitated. We lost more fresh water than we thought. Samuel frowned. How much? Nearly a third of our supply. Silence. Fresh water. Not the storm. Not the damaged mast. Water would now determine whether the voyage could continue. Captain Brooks immediately unfolded the chart of the Western Atlantic. If the current is favorable, we alter course for the American coast. There are fishing stations south of Cape Cod where we can replenish supplies. Samuel studied the map. That will add several days. It will also keep 260 people alive. No one argued. As dawn slowly brightened the eastern horizon, the strange fog that had surrounded them during the night began to dissolve. Little by little, the outline of the morning grace faded into the morning light. Not because she had sunk, not because she had vanished, but because she had always been much farther away than anyone aboard the Atlantic Star had believed. Captain Brooks raised his telescope one final time. The abandoned vessel drifted quietly upon the distant Atlantic, still lifeless, still silent, carried only by the same powerful current that had trapped her crew 23 years earlier. He lowered the telescope and quietly removed his hat. May they finally find peace, he murmured. No sailor laughed. Every man aboard understood. The greatest danger they had faced was never a ghost ship. It was an ocean capable of deceiving even the most experienced eyes. But the Atlantic was not yet finished with them. As the sun climbed above the horizon, the lookout called down once more. Smoke. Every head turned west. Far beyond the morning mist, a thick column of black smoke rose into the sky. Captain Brooks frowned. Steamships were still rare in 1838, and no scheduled vessel should have been anywhere near this route. He slowly lifted his telescope. For several long moments, he said nothing. Then he lowered it. That's no steamship. Samuel's expression tightened. What is it? The captain answered quietly. A ship. He paused. And she's on fire. Part 7. The Burning Ship. Morning arrived slowly over the western Atlantic, its pale golden light spreading across the restless sea as though the ocean itself had survived a long and exhausting night. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind broken clouds that drifted lazily toward the eastern horizon, while the Atlantic Star sailed through long rolling swells that gently lifted her weathered hull. Every sailor aboard carried visible signs of fatigue. Their clothes were still damp with salt water, their hands were raw from pulling ropes through the hurricane, and their eyes revealed that very few had managed more than a few moments of sleep. Yet despite the exhaustion that hung over the ship, a renewed sense of purpose spread quietly among the crew. They had survived. The Atlantic Star was damaged but alive. Her foremast had lost part of its rigging, several barrels of fresh water had been washed overboard, and a handful of lifeboats required repair, but the ship herself had proven once again why so many experienced captains considered her one of the strongest passenger vessels ever built in an American shipyard. Captain Nathaniel Brooks remained standing near the bow, the brass telescope pressed gently against his eye as he continued watching the distant column of black smoke rising beyond the horizon. Unlike the strange lights they had witnessed during the previous night, this sight obeyed every law of nature. Smoke climbed steadily into the sky, thickening as the morning breeze carried it westward. Whatever had happened, there could be little doubt that another ship was in serious trouble. Samuel Reed stepped quietly beside him. Still burning, Brooks lowered the telescope. Worse than before. Could she already be sinking? The captain remained silent for a moment before answering. If she's burning that fiercely, her crew will abandon her long before she sinks. Samuel understood immediately. And if there aren't enough lifeboats? Brooks nodded. They'll be at the mercy of the Atlantic. No sailor needed further explanation. The ocean had claimed thousands of lives that way, not through spectacular storms, not through giant waves, but through hours of slow exposure in freezing water while rescue remained just beyond the horizon. Within minutes, the ship's bell rang 3 clear times. Every officer assembled upon the quarterdeck while passengers watched quietly from a respectful distance. Captain Brooks unrolled the navigation chart across a broad wooden table and placed his finger upon their estimated position. We're approximately 120 nautical miles southeast of Nantucket, he began. The burning vessel lies northwest of our present course. Samuel studied the chart. If we divert, we lose almost 2 full days. No one spoke. Every sailor knew what that meant. Fresh water was already limited. Several passengers had been injured during the hurricane. Food had to be carefully rationed until they reached land. Changing course carried real risk. Captain Brooks looked around at the faces surrounding him. I won't order any man to risk his life without asking first. He paused. If we continue east, we may reach our destination safely. His voice grew quieter. If we turn north, we may save hundreds. For several long seconds, only the sound of waves could be heard. Then the oldest sailor aboard, Boatswain William Hargreaves, stepped forward. His beard had turned completely white years earlier, and countless scars marked his weathered hands. My younger brother drowned off Cape Hatteras 27 years ago, he said softly. A merchant ship passed him without stopping. He looked directly at the captain. I've prayed every day that another crew would never make that same choice. One after another. Every sailor nodded. Not a single man objected. Captain Brooks smiled gently. Then we alter course. The great wheel turned steadily beneath the helmsman's hands. The Atlantic Star leaned gracefully into the wind as her bow swung northward. Fresh sails were trimmed. Rigging tightened. Within minutes, the old passenger ship was racing toward the distant smoke with every ounce of speed her weathered hull could still produce. The passengers soon learned why the course had changed. Clara Whitmore stood near the rail listening as Samuel explained the situation. There are people out there. He nodded. We believe so. Can we reach them? Samuel looked toward the horizon. I sincerely hope we aren't already too late. Clara quietly opened her journal. This time she did not write about storms. She wrote about decisions, about how true courage often appeared long before anyone faced danger. It appeared the moment someone chose to help another stranger. By early afternoon, the smell reached them before the ship itself became visible. Burned timber, pitch, tar, smoke. The wind carried it across the Atlantic long before anyone could clearly see the source. Then, little by little, a dark shape emerged beyond the haze. She was a two-masted American merchant brig. Her stern still floated proudly upon the water, but flames consumed nearly the entire forward half of the vessel. Thick black smoke poured skyward while bright orange fire climbed the rigging, devouring sail after sail with frightening speed. The words painted across her stern remained barely visible through the smoke. Liberty Bell, Boston. Captain Brooks immediately recognized the design. She was a coastal trading vessel, probably carrying timber, cotton, whale oil, and manufactured goods between New England ports. The worst possible cargo for a fire at sea. Barrels of whale oil exploded one after another, sending towering columns of flame high above the deck. Burning fragments rained into the ocean, where they hissed violently upon the cold Atlantic before disappearing beneath the waves. Samuel lifted his telescope. Lifeboats. Several tiny boats drifted helplessly almost half a mile away from the burning ship. The captain quickly counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Only 4. Far too few. Even from this distance, dozens of frightened figures could be seen waving pieces of cloth above their heads. Some stood, some knelt. Others clung desperately to the sides of overcrowded boats as rough swells lifted them higher and higher. Captain Brooks took a slow breath. They're alive. A quiet smile crossed his face. Thank God. Then his expression became serious once again. Mr. Reed. Captain, prepare every rescue boat. Yes, sir. And tell the passengers. He glanced across the crowded deck where nearly every traveler had gathered to watch the terrible scene unfolding ahead. Today the Atlantic Star belongs to everyone in those lifeboats. Within moments, the ship erupted into organized activity. Ropes were prepared, blankets gathered, doctors unpacked medical instruments. The cook ordered every kettle filled with hot broth. Even passengers volunteered without being asked. Strong young men offered to row rescue boats. Women began preparing dry clothing for survivors. Children quietly carried blankets from cabin to cabin. No one stood idle. For the first time since leaving New York Harbor, every soul aboard the Atlantic Star worked together for one purpose: to save complete strangers. Just as the first rescue boat was lowered into the sea, a deafening explosion echoed across the Atlantic. The Liberty Bell disappeared behind a massive ball of orange fire. The force of the blast sent burning pieces of timber hundreds of feet into the air. Even the Atlantic Star rocked violently from the distant shockwave. For one terrifying moment, Captain Brooks feared they had arrived too late. He lifted his telescope once more. The lifeboats were now drifting directly toward a field of burning wreckage, and the wind, which had been calm all afternoon, had begun to strengthen once again. Part 7. The Burning Ship. The explosion rolled across the Atlantic like distant thunder, its echo lingering over the water long after the flames had settled into a towering column of black smoke. For several heartbeats, nobody aboard the Atlantic Star moved. Every sailor, every passenger, and every child stood frozen as burning fragments of timber rained into the sea nearly half a mile ahead. The once proud merchant brig Liberty Bell had become a floating furnace. her foremast collapsing into the inferno while thick clouds of sparks drifted upward and disappeared into the morning sky. The sight was both magnificent and heartbreaking, a reminder that the sea could destroy in a single hour what skilled craftsmen had spent years building. Captain Nathaniel Brooks lowered his telescope and took one slow breath before speaking. His voice remained calm, but every officer aboard recognized the urgency beneath it. "The fire has reached her cargo," he said. "There won't be much of the ship left within the hour. We are no longer trying to save a vessel. We are trying to save lives." Those words spread quickly across the deck. No one argued. No one hesitated. The mission had become painfully clear. The Atlantic Star herself had survived the hurricane only because her crew had worked together without panic. Now another ship's passengers depended upon that same discipline. Samuel Reed stepped toward the davits where the rescue boats hung ready. For sturdy longboats were lowered carefully over the side, while experienced sailors climbed aboard carrying coils of rope, wool blankets, fresh water, lanterns, and medical chests. Every oar was inspected once more before touching the sea. The Atlantic looked peaceful again, but Captain Brooks knew better than to trust appearances. Long swells still rolled beneath the surface, and floating debris from the burning brig could overturn a small boat in seconds if approached carelessly. As the first rescue boat entered the water, Brooks rested a hand upon Samuel's shoulder. "Remember," he said quietly, "people who believe they are about to drown often stop thinking clearly. Fear can make good people dangerous. Bring them aboard gently, but keep your men together." Samuel nodded. "I understand. And one more thing." Samuel looked back. "Children first." Without another word, the rescue boats pushed away from the Atlantic Star, their oars dipping into the cold water in perfect rhythm as they raced toward the drifting lifeboats. From the quarterdeck, Clara Whitmore watched the rescue unfold through her father's old brass spyglass. Until that morning, she had believed courage belonged only to soldiers or famous explorers whose names appeared in newspapers. Yet as she watched ordinary sailors rowing toward burning wreckage without the slightest thought for their own safety, she realized courage often lived quietly inside people whose names history would never remember. She opened her journal despite the wind tugging gently at its pages. Great acts of heroism rarely announce themselves. They begin with ordinary people making one difficult decision after another. She paused only long enough to watch the nearest rescue boat disappear behind a swell before continuing to write. "If this voyage is remembered, I hope it is not because of the storm. I hope it is because strangers refuse to abandon strangers." The first lifeboat from the Liberty Belle came into view barely 15 minutes later. It had been built to carry perhaps 15 people. Instead, nearly 30 crowded its narrow hull. Several passengers sat ankle-deep in seawater, while others clung desperately to the gunwales, their faces pale with exhaustion. A young father held an infant tightly beneath his coat to shield the child from the cold Atlantic wind. An elderly woman stared silently toward the burning ship she had escaped only moments earlier, her expression too numb for tears. When Samuel's boat drew alongside, relief spread across the survivors like the first warmth of sunrise after a bitter night. "We're from the Atlantic Star," Samuel called. "You're safe now." For several seconds, nobody answered. Many simply lowered their heads in quiet gratitude. One elderly sailor aboard the crowded lifeboat finally removed his cap. "I never thought we'd see another ship." Samuel smiled gently. "Neither did we." The transfer began slowly. No rushing, no shouting. Children were lifted first. One by one, frightened mothers passed their sons and daughters into waiting hands until every child had been safely moved to the rescue boat. Then came the injured. a young deckhand whose arm had been badly burned while lowering the lifeboats, an elderly merchant suffering from a broken ankle, a cook whose face was blackened by smoke after spending nearly an hour helping trapped passengers escape the flames. Each survivor was carefully wrapped in blankets before being given fresh water. Only after every passenger had been transferred did the crew of the Liberty Bell agree to leave their own lifeboat. Captain Brooks had always believed that the character of a sailor revealed itself not during calm seas, but during disaster. Looking through his telescope, he quietly smiled. Every crewman aboard the Liberty Bell had remained until the last passenger was safe. Professional seamen, exactly as they should be. Meanwhile, the second rescue boat encountered a far more dangerous situation. One of the overloaded lifeboats had struck floating wreckage from the explosion. A jagged beam had torn through its side, and icy seawater poured steadily into the hull despite desperate attempts to bail it out with hats, buckets, and even bare hands. As Samuel watched from a distance, he saw the frightened passengers beginning to stand all at once. The small boat rocked violently. "Sit down," one sailor shouted. Nobody listened. Fear had taken control. The lifeboat leaned dangerously toward one side. Another sudden movement, and everyone aboard would be thrown into the Atlantic. Samuel immediately altered course. Hard to port, the rescue boat surged forward. Just as the damaged lifeboat began tipping, Samuel leaped across the narrow gap, separating the two vessels. His boots landed heavily upon the flooded hull, sending another wave of water over the passengers' feet. "Everyone stay where you are." His voice rang across the sea with such confidence that the panic stopped almost instantly. "Look at me," he continued. "You're going home. But you'll only get there if this boat stays upright." One frightened child reached for his mother's hand. The other slowly sat down. The lifeboat steadied once more. Only then did Samuel allow himself a quiet breath of relief. Within minutes, ropes secured the damaged boat alongside the rescue launch, and every survivor was safely transferred without another incident. Back aboard the Atlantic Star, the ship's doctor, Dr. Elias Warren, transformed the main dining hall into a temporary infirmary. Tables became hospital beds. Blankets covered the polished wooden floor. Passengers who only hours earlier had been strangers now worked side by side, preparing warm soup, clean bandages, and dry clothing. The first rescued families climbed aboard just before sunset. Some kissed the deck. Others embraced complete strangers. One little girl no older than 6 quietly handed Captain Brooks a small seashell she had carried inside her pocket throughout the ordeal. "My father said brave captains deserve lucky shells." Brooks accepted it with a gentle smile. "Then I'll treasure it." He slipped the tiny shell into the same pocket where his silver watch rested. It would remain there for the rest of his life. As darkness approached, only one rescue boat remained missing, Samuel's. Captain Brooks stood silently at the rail, scanning the fading horizon. The smoke from the Liberty Bell had begun to disappear into the evening sky. The burning ship herself was slowly settling lower into the Atlantic. Another hour, perhaps less, and she would be gone forever. Yet Samuel's boat had still not returned. The captain raised his telescope again, far beyond the floating wreckage, barely visible against the crimson sunset. He finally spotted it. One small boat, almost motionless, not rowing toward the Atlantic Star, not drifting away, simply waiting. Brooks frowned. Something was wrong, very wrong. Without taking his eyes from the horizon, he gave a single order: "Lower my boat." The sailors looked at him in surprise. "Captain," one officer began. Brooks shook his head. "If Mr. Reed isn't coming back." He paused, his gaze never leaving the distant silhouette. "Then I'm going to him." Part 8. Final. The man found floating alone. Section 1. Into the Silent Atlantic. Without another word, Captain Nathaniel Brooks stepped into the waiting lifeboat. The ropes creaked as the small craft descended from the wounded Atlantic Star, every inch of its journey accompanied by the groan of strained timber and rusted steel. Above him, the surviving crew leaned over the rail in silence. No one wished him luck. Among sailors, luck was never spoken aloud. The boat kissed the water with a gentle splash. Brooks settled onto the stern bench, while four experienced seamen took their oars. Thomas Doyle sat nearest the bow. Benjamin Hart checked the compass one last time. George Mercer loosened the painter line, and Edward Collins glanced nervously toward the wall of gray mist that surrounded them. The rope was cast free. Almost immediately, the Atlantic Star began fading behind them. First the bow disappeared, then the bridge. Then the great funnels dissolved into the fog until nothing remained but an empty horizon. It felt as though the ocean had swallowed an entire ship without making a sound. Northeast, Brooks said quietly. The men obeyed. The oars dipped into the freezing Atlantic with perfect rhythm. Splash, pull, splash, pull. No one spoke again. Only the sea answered. An hour passed, or perhaps two. Time behaved strangely inside the fog. Without the sun or the stars, every minute resembled the last. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, its surface smooth enough to reflect the pale gray sky above. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the silence. Benjamin Hart checked the compass. It still holds steady, Captain. Brooks nodded. Good. Yet something felt wrong. Not dangerous. Not immediate. Simply unnatural. The Atlantic was never truly silent. There were always gulls. Always distant waves breaking somewhere. Always the cry of another ship carried by the wind. Today, nothing. The sea felt abandoned. Thomas Doyle suddenly lifted one hand. Hold. The rowing stopped. Everyone listened. At first Brooks heard only water brushing softly against the hull. Then, a faint sound. Not a whistle. Not a bell. Breathing. Slow. Uneven. Someone was breathing nearby. George Mercer turned slowly. I heard it too. The men scanned the fog. Nothing. Then Collins pointed toward port. There. Something floated on the surface barely 30 yards away. At first it resembled a bundle of torn canvas. The waves rolled it gently. Then an arm emerged. Benjamin Hart inhaled sharply. My God! It was a man. Row! The lifeboat surged forward. Within seconds they reached the drifting figure. He wore a heavy wool coat beneath an oilskin jacket now stiff with frozen salt. One hand still clutched a broken section of wooden spar. His face had turned almost white from cold. His beard carried tiny crystals of ice. Yet, his fingers moved. He's alive. George Mercer leaned dangerously over the side, while Doyle grabbed the stranger beneath the shoulders. Lift! The unconscious man was hauled aboard with enormous effort. Water poured from his clothing. His lips were blue. His breathing barely visible. Brooks immediately removed his own heavy coat and wrapped it around the stranger. Blankets. Benjamin covered him with everything they had. Edward uncorked a small flask. Just a little. A few drops of warm brandy touched the man's lips. Nothing. Another minute passed. Then suddenly, he coughed. Violently. Salt water spilled onto the floorboards. His eyes fluttered open. Cloudy. Confused. He stared upward without recognition. For several long seconds, he seemed unable to understand where he was. Finally, his cracked lips moved. Captain. Brooks leaned closer. I'm Captain Nathaniel Brooks. The stranger blinked slowly. No, he whispered. Not you. His breathing trembled. Captain Whitmore. The name settled over the boat like a winter frost. None of Brooks' crew recognized it. But Brooks did. Captain Elias Whitmore, master of the passenger steamer Morning Grace, a ship reported missing nearly 20 years earlier. No distress call, no wreckage, no survivors. She had simply vanished during a winter crossing between New York and Liverpool. Every newspaper had called it one of the Atlantic's greatest mysteries. Brooks stared silently at the exhausted stranger. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't. The missing ship had disappeared decades ago, yet the man lying before him could not have been much older than 50. His face bore hardship, but not 20 years of it. The stranger slowly reached inside his soaked coat. His shaking hand withdrew a tarnished silver pocket watch. The engraved lid still shone beneath the salt. Brooks carefully opened it. Inside was an inscription, presented to Captain Elias Whitmore by the officers and crew of the Morning Grace. December 1906. Brooks felt the cold deepen despite the heavy coat around his shoulders. The watch had stopped. Its hands rested forever at 2:17. The exact time, according to old newspaper reports, that the Morning Grace had last been seen through a snowstorm before disappearing forever. The stranger closed his eyes again. Barely audible, he whispered, "I have been trying to come home." The men looked at one another. No one spoke. Far beyond the drifting lifeboat, hidden somewhere inside the endless gray Atlantic, a deep ship's bell rang once. Slow, lonely, as if answering the words of a man who had been lost far longer than anyone could explain. Section 2. The last survivor of the Morning Grace. The sound of the bell faded into the fog. No one spoke. The only noise that remained was the slow creak of the lifeboat as it rose and fell upon the gentle swells. Captain Brooks kept his eyes on the exhausted stranger. The silver pocket watch still rested in his hand. Its hands had stopped forever at 2:17. He had read about that watch once before. Years ago, not in a newspaper, but in the official inquiry into the disappearance of the Morning Grace. Captain Elias Whitmore had been presented with a silver watch by his officers before the ship's final voyage. The inscription matched the report exactly. There could be no mistake. Yet the man lying before him could not possibly be Whitmore. Whitmore would have been nearly 70 by now. The stranger looked tired, weathered, perhaps 50, no older, as though the sea had stolen everything from him, except time itself. Benjamin Hart finally broke the silence. "Captain," Brooks looked up, "if that truly belongs to the Morning Grace." He hesitated. "Then who is he?" The stranger answered before Brooks could. His eyes remained closed. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "I was." He coughed painfully. "Second officer." He struggled for breath. "Jonathan Hale." The name meant nothing to the crew, but Brooks remembered it. He had studied every report after joining the Atlantic Steam Navigation Company. Every missing vessel, every unexplained wreck. Jonathan Hale had indeed served aboard the Morning Grace. 20 years ago, Brooks stared at him in disbelief. "You disappeared in 1907. Hale slowly opened his eyes. "No," he whispered. "We disappeared." His gaze drifted toward the endless fog. "Last night." The men exchanged uneasy glances. No one laughed. No one questioned him, because his expression carried no madness, only exhaustion and sorrow, the kind of sorrow that could not be invented. Brooks spoke gently. "What happened?" For several seconds Hale remained silent. Then he began, not quickly, not dramatically, simply as one tired sailor telling another the truth. "The sea was calm. We left New York carrying nearly 400 souls. Families, children, immigrants, businessmen, nothing unusual." He swallowed painfully. "The weather changed 3 days later. A fog settled over us. The captain reduced speed. We sounded the whistle every minute. Visibility." He shook his head weakly. "Less than 50 yards. Brooks listened without interruption. Everything sounded ordinary. Every Atlantic captain had sailed through fog. Nothing unusual. Yet, then, Hale continued. We saw another ship. George Mercer frowned. Another liner? Hale slowly nodded. It appeared without warning. No lights. No smoke. No flag. It crossed our bow. Without making a sound, Benjamin looked toward Brooks. No one interrupted. Captain Whitmore ordered hard to port. We missed her. Barely. When the fog cleared, there was no ship. He closed his eyes. Nothing. The sea was empty. Edward Collins quietly whispered, "A phantom ship." Brooks immediately answered, "No." His voice remained firm. "There are no phantom ships." But even he sounded less certain than usual. Hale continued, "After that, the compass failed. The engine slowed. The wireless stopped working. Even the clocks." His voice trembled. The clock stopped. Brooks instinctively looked down at the silver watch. 2:17. Forever. We drifted. For hours. Maybe days. We couldn't tell. The fog never lifted. No sunrise. No sunset. Only gray. Hart tightened his grip on the oar. Every detail matched the strange conditions surrounding the Atlantic star. The silence. The compass. The endless fog. Then, Hale whispered. People began disappearing. No one moved. He continued. One sailor walked onto the deck and never returned. A steward entered the dining room. Gone. A child vanished from her mother's side. No scream. No struggle. They were simply, he searched for the word, absent. The lifeboat drifted quietly. No one dared interrupt him now. Captain Whitmore believed panic would destroy us. So he kept everyone calm. He told the passengers rescue would come. He smiled. He never stopped smiling. Hale's eyes filled with tears. He lied for their sake. Brooks lowered his head. He understood. Every captain carried that burden. Sometimes hope was the last duty, even when none remained. What happened to the ship? Brooks finally asked. Jonathan Hale stared into the fog. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Then, I don't know. The answer stunned everyone. I woke. Alone. The ship was gone. No passengers. No crew. No lifeboats. Only me. Floating. George Mercer quietly crossed himself. The fog around them seemed heavier now. Almost alive. Even the light had changed. The afternoon sun had disappeared somewhere behind layers of gray cloud. Everything became softer. Muted. Colorless. Suddenly, Jonathan Hale reached for Brooks' sleeve. His grip surprised everyone. For a man moments from death, his hand felt remarkably strong. Section 3. The truth hidden in the fog. For several long seconds, no one breathed. The shape ahead remained motionless. It was enormous, far larger than any fishing vessel, larger than a cargo steamer. Its bow rose from the mist like the wall of a fortress, dark against the pale gray sea. No smoke drifted from its funnels. No signal flags fluttered from its mast. No lights shone from its windows. It simply stood there, waiting. Benjamin Hart's voice trembled. Captain, is that? Brooks did not answer. He lifted the small brass telescope that had hung from his shoulder since leaving the Atlantic star. The lens trembled slightly in his hands. Through the fog, the outline slowly sharpened. A long black hull, two tall funnels, rows of passenger windows. The sea lapped gently against her sides. She looked untouched, almost new, as if she had sailed out of another age. Brooks focused on the bow. There, faded but still visible beneath years of salt and weather, were painted letters. Morning Grace. No one spoke, not because they were frightened, because none of them believed what they were seeing. The Morning Grace had vanished nearly 20 years ago, yet she floated before them exactly as she had left New York. Silent, Whole. Impossible. Jonathan Hale stared at the ship with tears in his eyes. I prayed, he whispered, that I would never see her again. Brooks lowered the telescope. You said you woke alone. I did. Then how is she here? Hale slowly shook his head. I don't know. It was always like that. You escaped. Brooks corrected. Hale looked toward the drifting sea. No. His answer came quietly. I was released. Those words settled heavily over the lifeboat. Released. Not rescued. Released. Benjamin swallowed. I don't like that word. Neither did Brooks. The mysterious liner drifted no closer, nor farther away. She remained exactly where she was, as though waiting for them to decide. Edward Collins whispered, We should turn back. George Mercer nodded immediately. We've found our survivor. That's enough. No good comes from approaching that ship. Brooks looked from one sailor to another. Every instinct as a captain agreed with them. His duty was clear. Return to the Atlantic Star. Deliver the survivor. Report what they had seen. But another duty, older than any written law, pulled at him. Every missing ship deserved an answer. Every family deserved the truth. He thought of the names listed in the old newspapers. Children who had never returned. Mothers who waited at docks until hope itself grew old. Wives who spent decades wondering whether their husbands had suffered. If the morning grace truly stood before him, then perhaps, for the first time in 20 years, someone could finally tell those families what had happened. Brooks made his decision. One look. His crew stared at him. We do not board. We do not separate. We approach close enough to identify her. If anything feels wrong. He looked directly at Doyle. We leave immediately. The men exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, one by one, they nodded. The oars dipped back into the sea. Slowly, the lifeboat crept toward the silent liner. The closer they came, the stranger everything became. There were no gulls resting on her rails. No rust streaked her hull. No broken windows. No storm damage. 20 years at sea should have left scars. Instead, the Morning Grace looked as though she had sailed only yesterday. Benjamin whispered, She hasn't aged. Brooks quietly replied, No, she hasn't. They came within 50 yards. The name on the bow became perfectly clear. Morning Grace. Gold lettering. Fresh. Untarnished. Jonathan Hale closed his eyes. That's how she looked. The last time I saw her. Then something moved. Not on deck. Inside. A curtain shifted behind one of the saloon windows. Edward's breath caught. Did you see that? No one answered. Because they all had. Another curtain moved. Then another. As though people walked quietly through the empty ship. Yet no faces appeared. No voices drifted across the water. Only silence. Brooks raised the telescope again. The grand staircase windows came into view. The polished wood gleamed softly. A chandelier hung from the ceiling. Perfect. Untouched. Then, for the briefest moment, he saw them. Dozens of people, standing perfectly still inside the entrance hall. Men in dark suits. Women in long coats. Children holding hands. Not moving. Not speaking. Simply watching. Every face turned toward the lifeboat. Brooks lowered the telescope instantly. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. What did you see? Mercer asked. Brooks hesitated, then answered honestly. Passengers. Jonathan Hale closed his eyes. They're still waiting. The words chilled every man in the boat. At that very moment, a gust of wind swept across the sea for the first time all day. The fog began to tear apart. Not everywhere. Only around the Morning Grace. For a few precious seconds, the entire ship stood revealed beneath the pale afternoon sky. She was beautiful, majestic, exactly as she must have appeared on the day she left New York. Then, without warning, the sunlight reached her hull, and Brooks noticed the truth. The lower half of the ship didn't exist. Where the hull should have met the sea, there was only fog. The Morning Grace was not floating on the Atlantic. She was disappearing into it, slowly, silently, like a memory fading from the world. Jonathan Hale smiled sadly. I told you, they never sank. They were simply. He looked toward the vanishing ship. Lost. The fog closed once more. The liner disappeared. No explosion. No great wave. No dramatic farewell. One heartbeat she was there. The next, only empty ocean remained. Benjamin Hart stared ahead in disbelief. There was a ship. There was. He looked around helplessly. Wasn't there? Captain Brooks never answered. Because, for the first time in his entire career, he no longer knew which answer was true. Part 8. Final. The last logbook. For a long moment after the Morning Grace vanished, the lifeboat drifted without direction. No one touched an oar. The sea had returned to its strange stillness, as though the great liner had never existed. Only the widening rings upon the water marked the place where they had seen her fade into the fog. Captain Brooks finally drew a slow breath. "Turn us about," he said quietly. "We're going back." The sailors obeyed at once. No one argued now. No one wished to remain in that stretch of ocean a moment longer than necessary. As the lifeboat began rowing westward, Jonathan Hale stirred beneath the blankets. His trembling hand disappeared inside his coat once more. "Captain." Brooks leaned closer. Hale withdrew a small leather book, swollen with seawater but carefully wrapped in oilcloth. The brass clasp had turned green with age. "The last logbook," he whispered. "Captain Whitmore gave it to me." Brooks accepted it with both hands. The leather felt impossibly old, yet it had survived. He opened the cover carefully. Inside, written in a firm naval hand, were the words, R.M.S. Morning Grace, Master's Private Log, Captain Elias Whitmore. Several pages had dissolved into unreadable stains, but the final entries remained surprisingly clear. Brooks held the book where the fading daylight could reach it. He began to read aloud. 14 January 1907, 11:40 p.m. Dense fog. Visibility nearly gone. Reduced speed to half ahead. Passengers calm. Barometer steady. 15 January, 1:55 a.m. Lookout reports another steamer crossing our bow. No lights visible. No signal answered. Altered course to avoid collision. 2:17 a.m. Compasses behaving irregularly. Engines answering slowly. Wireless silent. Clocks throughout the ship have stopped at the same minute. Crew unsettled. I have ordered calm maintained. 2:43 a.m. Fog surrounding the vessel has become strangely luminous. Several passengers report hearing bells where none exist. I do not record superstition lightly, yet something is profoundly wrong. 3:10 a.m. People missing. No trace found. Ship otherwise intact. I believe we are no longer upon any charted course known to me. Final entry, time unknown. If this book is found, let it be known that we did not abandon our passengers. The sea has taken us in a manner I cannot explain. Should any man escape, he is to carry home the names of those entrusted to my command. May God guide whoever reads this. Captain Elias Whitmore. The words ended there. No flourish. No farewell. Only duty carried to the final line. Brooks closed the book slowly. None of the sailors spoke. Jonathan Hale looked toward the empty fog behind them. The captain stayed on the bridge, he said quietly. He ordered everyone to remain calm. He believed rescue would come. A tear rolled down his weathered face. When I left, he saluted me. I never saw him again. Brooks placed one hand on Hale's shoulder. You've carried this alone for 20 years. Hale slowly shook his head. No, I've carried it for one night." Brooks said nothing. There was no answer to give. The fog ahead gradually began to thin. Slowly, the scarred outline of the Atlantic star emerged from the gray. Broken, damaged, but wonderfully real. For the first time since leaving her, every man in the lifeboat smiled. Home. As they drew alongside, cheers echoed from the deck. Ropes were lowered. Strong hands pulled Jonathan Hale aboard first. Captain Brooks climbed onto the deck last, the leather logbook tucked safely beneath his coat. Before stepping away, he turned once more toward the empty sea. The place where the Morning Grace had stood was empty. Nothing remained, only calm Atlantic water stretching toward the horizon. 3 days later, a rescue steamer finally reached the Atlantic Star. The remaining passengers and crew were safely transferred. Jonathan Hale was taken ashore with them. Doctors examined him for days. They found no explanation. His body showed signs of exhaustion and exposure, but not of a man who had spent 20 years adrift. No one could explain it. Hale himself never tried. Captain Brooks personally delivered the logbook to the maritime authorities. The names inside were carefully copied. Every passenger, every crew member, every child. Families who had waited decades without answers finally learned one simple truth. Their loved ones had not abandoned one another. They had remained together until the very end. For many, that was enough. Jonathan Hale lived quietly for only 6 more months. He never returned to sea. One peaceful autumn evening, he passed away in his sleep. The silver watch stopped forever at 2:17 was found resting beside his bed, still unwound, still silent. He was buried overlooking the Atlantic. At his request, no dates were carved beneath his name. Only one sentence appeared on the stone. He finally came home. Captain Nathaniel Brooks sailed for many more years. He never again spoke publicly about what he had witnessed beyond the fog. Whenever reporters asked about the mysterious disappearance of the Morning Grace, he offered only one reply. "I found the answer." But some answers belong to the sea. On calm winter nights, sailors crossing the North Atlantic still tell a quiet story. They speak of a beautiful passenger liner that sometimes appears within the fog. Her windows glow warmly. Her decks are peaceful. No cries for help are ever heard. Only a distant bell, and a captain standing proudly upon the bridge, watching over every soul still in his care. Old sailors never chase that ship. They simply remove their caps, offer a silent salute, and continue on their own voyage. For they believe the Morning Grace is no longer lost. She is merely sailing a route that no map has ever been able to draw. And somewhere beyond the reach of storms, clocks, and time itself, Captain Whitmore and his passengers finally found the harbor they had been searching for all along. The Atlantic rolled gently beneath the stars. The fog drifted slowly across the water. And at last, it let them go. The end.